how do we know that the Bible hasn't been changed? That's a really good question. I mean, we're talking about documents that are 2,000 years old. And the interesting thing is, if you talk to any historian who's studied this quite a bit, they'll tell you that these are the most reliable historical documents written since 500 years ago and earlier. Basically, since the invention of the printing press, basically. That's not an exact statement. But here are a couple of interesting facts about the New Testament documents. Of course, first I'm talking about the New Testament documents being that reliable. There are 5,366 separate Greek manuscripts. Now, the next most reliable document from that time period would be the Iliad, and we only have 643 copies of the Iliad. So that's a huge difference. The Bible stands out among the other manuscripts from that time, the other writings from that time, as having way more manuscripts, a lot to compare, and contrast, looking for errors. And actually, we find that between those 5,000 Greek manuscripts, we only find about a 2% difference between the manuscripts, and many of these differences are minor differences, just transposing two words. And the most amazing thing is that between all those different books with different authors from that long ago, we find no contradictions. Now, another important thing is not just that we have so many manuscripts, but how early these manuscripts are. We have the Codex Sinaiticus, which is a certain document that we have. It's almost a nearly complete New Testament, also the Vaticanus, and those are from before 400 AD. We also have a nearly complete Gospel of John from before 200 AD. And then, most importantly, we have the John Rylands Papyrus, which was found in Egypt, so it traveled quite a bit of distance. And it was dated back to 130 AD. And this is not dated by Christian scholars, but by those who are sometimes pretty critical of Christianity. So not only do we have a lot of manuscripts, but they're very early. So when someone says, well, couldn't they have been changed? Well, yes, they could have, except we can go back to these early documents and we look at them, and they are no different than what we have today. In fact, the Bible is translated, especially a good translation, is translated from those early manuscripts, and the majority of those manuscripts. Now, the next most reliable document from that time is the Iliad, and the earliest manuscript of the Iliad that we have was dated to 500 years after it was written. So that's 500 years in which changes could have accumulated. Here we only have 130 years to, at the most, 150 years, and that's oftentimes within the same generation. And so it would be very difficult to be writing false statements about such a prominent person as Jesus and not have someone point out to them, hey, I was there, this is false. Now, if we're talking about the Old Testament documents, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the Nash Papyrus. They predate Christ, and the amazing thing is they give a lot of prophecies that talk about Christ. But we know from a couple of different methods that the Dead Sea Scrolls are from around 100 BC, and of course they're passed down writings from even earlier. All right,
good. And I'll just jump on one thing you said, which you said no contradictions. And I've heard people say, well, what about all the contradictory stuff, that's found in the Bible? Have you heard people say that? And the funny part about that is you say, well, for example, and there's usually no examples. They just kind of heard that, they repeated that from something somebody said. But there are some apparent contradictions. For example, how did Judas die? Luke says it's one way and Matthew says it's another. But if you piece them two together, and for me, that makes the point that the Bible wasn't something that a bunch of men or whoever got in a room and held it together and said, let's write all this down and start this following and just make it up. Because if they had, they would have got all their stories straight and said exactly the same thing. I mean, how do you know all your kids are lying? If they're all saying the exact same thing, They're telling that story from four different perspectives. When you piece it together, you realize it's complementary, and these are called apparent contradictions. And in this sort of science, where they sit down and look at documents, this actually lends credence to the argument that they are reliable, not takes away from it, because they're not saying these witnesses are saying things that complement each other, not just parroting each other's answers.
I'm sorry, can I give just two quick resources that people might find helpful? One is a New Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell, and another one is The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable by F.F. Bruce.